My name is Olivia Pina, captain in the United States Army. At 34, I thought I was trained to handle anything. But no drill prepared me to stand in front of two fresh dirt mounds, my husband's and my 7-year-old daughter's, while the front row of chairs meant for my parents sat completely empty. While trying to breathe through the suffocating hugs of condolences, my phone buzzed. It was my mother. She sent a text to the wrong person. It was a picture of her and my dad grinning at a resort in Hawaii with a message meant for someone else. Finally, away from that depressing atmosphere, the white lilies there looked so cheap. That bullet didn't draw blood, but it killed whatever was left of my soul. They thought they buried their weak little girl that day. They didn't know they just woke up a soldier. Before we get into my story, let me know where you're listening from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe the most ruthless betrayals always come from the ones you'd never suspect. Gunfire, 3 volleys, 21 shots. The crack of the M14 rifles split the heavy Oklahoma air. The smell of sulfur and damp earth coated the back of my throat. I stood rigid in my Army service uniform, shoulders pinned back, chin parallel to the ground. My jaw ached from locking it down so hard my teeth ground together. A sergeant stepped forward, his white gloves pristine. He handed me the American flag folded into a tight, heavy triangle. The rough cotton scraped against my bare palms. On behalf of the President of the United States, the words blurred. I stared straight ahead. Not at the polished oak caskets. I couldn't look at them yet. Instead, my eyes locked on the front row of the staging area under the green canopy. The family row. 3 black folding chairs. Completely empty. My commanding officer, a 2-star general with gravel in his voice, leaned in. His eyes held a quiet, unbearable pity. Did your family make it, Captain? I didn't speak. I couldn't. I just gave a tight mechanical shake of my head. The general swallowed hard. He stepped back. That silence, that heavy, humiliating silence from a man who had seen war, was worse than a physical blow. The whole unit saw it. Captain Pina, top of her class, left to bury her entire world by herself. 2 hours later, I was standing in the dead center of my living room at Fort Sill housing. The air conditioner hummed, a useless droning sound. The house reeked of white lilies. Massive arrangements sent by the base by David's civilian engineering firm by people who actually gave a damn. My phone vibrated in my pocket, a heavy, sluggish buzz. I pulled it out. A text from my mother, Ashley. I had called her 3 days ago from the morgue. I stood on the freezing concrete floor, my husband and baby girl behind a steel door, and begged my mother just to come. Just to be a mother. She told me she was bedridden with grief and couldn't physically bear the flight. I opened the message. It was a photo, bright blue water, a poolside cabana in Maui. My father, Norman, holding a Mai Tai. My mother, tanned and smiling behind designer sunglasses. Underneath a text she clearly meant for her country club gossip circle. Finally, away from that depressing atmosphere. The white lilies there looked so cheap. Anyway, Leo really needed a vacation after enduring the news about Olivia. Leo, my 32-year-old little brother, the golden boy. He had to endure my tragedy, so they took him to Hawaii. I didn't scream. I didn't throw the phone against the wall. I just stared at the screen until it went black. Acid chewed through my stomach lining. My own mother looked at the slaughter of my family and saw nothing but an inconvenience to her favorite son's mood. My dead child wasn't worth the price of a plane ticket to Tulsa, but Leo needed a beach to process his grief. I looked around the house. The silence pressed against my eardrums. By the front door, Sophia's pink light-up sneakers sat crooked on the mat. On the fridge, a crayon drawing of our dog held up by a cheap plastic magnet. On the coffee table, David's mug. A dark ring of dried coffee still stuck to the bottom. The chaplain's knock on my door 3 nights ago echoed in my skull. The flashing red and blue lights on the interstate. The mangled steel of our family SUV. A drunk driver crossing the median at 80 miles an hour. In a split second, I went from a wife and a mother to a ghost haunting my own life. And my parents ran away to the beach. My knees gave out. I hit the hardwood floor hard. The sharp pain shot up my shins, but I welcomed it. It was something real. Something I could process. My pristine blue uniform crumpled around me. The brass buttons dug into my chest. I curled into a ball next to the coffee table. No wailing, no screaming, just a hot, silent stream of tears soaking into the stiff collar of my shirt. I caught my reflection in the dark glass of the television screen. Red, swollen eyes. A woman stripped down to the bone. A soldier. I took an oath to defend this country. I lived by honor, duty, and loyalty. But the loyalty I freely gave to the people who shared my blood, they wiped their feet on it. They threw it in the trash like a cheap gas station receipt. Something cold snapped inside my chest. A clean, sharp break. The desperate, pathetic daughter who just wanted her mom to hold her, she died in this room. The pain of losing David and Sophia was a gaping wound. It would bleed forever. But the pain my parents inflicted, that wasn't a wound. That was a target. I slowly pushed myself up off the floor. The brass on my uniform caught the dim light from the window. If my pain meant nothing to them, then their existence now meant nothing to me. No more excuses. No more hoping they would magically change into the parents I needed. I walked over to the trash can and picked up the massive arrangement of white lilies. I shoved them deep into the garbage. I stood back staring at the empty space in the living room. It felt exactly like the void left by those 3 black folding chairs at the cemetery. But this wasn't the first time. I knew that suffocating emptiness. I knew the exact shape of an empty chair. I had memorized it when I was 15 years old, burning up with a fever, staring at a hospital door that was never going to open. The cardboard dust coated the back of my throat. I sat cross-legged on the hardwood floor of the Fort Sill housing unit. A fortress of brown U-Haul boxes surrounded me. The house was dead quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator. Packing up the ghosts of your own life is a mechanical process. Tape the bottom, wrap the memories in cheap bubble wrap, seal it, label it. Pretend your hands aren't shaking. I reached into a plastic storage bin and my fingers brushed against something hard. A purple plastic toy stethoscope. Sophia's. My chest seized. The air rushed out of my lungs. I closed my eyes and suddenly I wasn't an army captain in an empty house. I was back at a heavy oak dining table in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The smell of overcooked roast beef and cheap gravy. The clinking of silverware. I was 17. I had just slid a heavy cardstock certificate across the wood toward my father. Top Cadet, JROTC. The gold foil seal caught the overhead light. I had run miles-shined boots until my knuckles bled and memorized manuals just to earn it. My dad, Norman, didn't even put his fork down. He glanced at it, grunted. Good. Then he shifted his entire body toward my brother. Hell of a catch on the 50-yard line Friday night, Leo. Scouts are going to be crawling all over you. My mother, Ashley, reached across the table. She didn't look at me. She just placed her hand flat on my certificate and physically pushed it into a pile of unpaid bills and junk mail to make room for Leo's second helping of mashed potatoes. It was a physical message. Leo was the investment. I was the overhead. I gripped the toy stethoscope tighter. The cold plastic pulled another memory from the dark, the one that explained the 3 empty chairs at the cemetery. I was 15. St. John Medical Center, double pneumonia. I remember the sharp smell of industrial bleach and the rhythmic hollow beep of the heart monitor. I was drowning in my own lung fluid. My skin burned. The IV needle dug into a bruised vein on the back of my hand every time I shivered. I turned my head on the stiff hospital pillow and stared at the cheap vinyl chair next to the bed. It was completely empty. My parents were in a Ford Expedition hauling a trailer down I-35 south to Dallas. Leo had an audition, a gig for some no-name garage band that played bad cover songs. The heavy plastic landline on the hospital wall rang. A nurse handed it to me. It was Mom. I could hear the loud hum of highway tires over the receiver. The nurses get paid to keep you breathing, Olivia, she said, her voice dripping with irritation. Leo can't miss this shot. We'll be back Sunday. Click. Dial tone. I lay there staring at the acoustic ceiling tiles. The fever was hot, but the cold realization in my gut was freezing. I learned the math of the Ramos family that day. My failing lungs weighed less than my brother's guitar strings. But the memory that actually forged the armor I wear today, that was Major. Major was a 100-pound German shepherd I pulled out of a cardboard box behind a strip mall. I raised him, fed him, trained him. He slept at the foot of my bed. He was the only breathing thing in that Tulsa house that looked at me first when I walked through the door. Leo hated him. Leo hated anything that didn't worship Leo. One Tuesday afternoon, my brother walked into the kitchen, crocodile tears streaming down his face. He held out his forearm. A shallow red scratch. "The dog bit me," he sobbed. I dropped to the linoleum floor. I checked Major's mouth. No blood, no aggression. The dog was wagging his tail. I begged. I swore on my life Major didn't bite him. It was a fence scratch. A lie. Dad didn't even look at me. He grabbed Major's heavy leather collar. "He's going to a farm in Broken Arrow." They threw my only friend into the back of a pickup truck. A kill shelter, probably. They dumped my only source of unconditional love because the golden boy threw a tantrum and wanted the spotlight back. Missing out on Christmas presents didn't hurt. Losing Major broke me. It taught me that love in that house was strictly conditional, and I didn't meet the terms. So I left. The morning I turned 18, I walked into a recruiting office and signed the papers. The Army wasn't a career choice. It was an extraction. I put on the boots. I laced them tight. Out there in the dirt and the mud, the rules were cut in stone. You run the miles, you get the score. You qualify on the rifle range, you wear the badge. It was pure, brutal merit. The brass on your collar didn't care who your daddy liked best. I found a brotherhood. And then I found David. He was a civilian structural engineer contracted on base. He smelled like graphite sawdust and black coffee. He watched me iron my uniform shirts with a ruler and just smiled. He didn't think my discipline was weird. He didn't call me a rebel. He loved the soldier in me. He gave me Sophia. They built a fortress around me, a real home. Now that fortress was just packing tape and cardboard. The monsters from my childhood were circling the perimeter again, whispering that I was always meant to be the shadow, that I didn't deserve the light. If you've ever been the scapegoat in your own family, if you know the exact suffocating weight of being pushed aside for the golden child, do me a favor. Drop a 1 in the comments right now. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let's stand together. Because surviving a toxic bloodline is a war they don't give out medals for. I dropped the purple stethoscope into a box labeled Sophia. I grabbed the heavy tape dispenser. I pulled it sharp. The loud, violent screech of the adhesive ripped through the dead air of the living room. I slammed the tape down over the cardboard seam, dragging my thumb hard across it to seal it shut. My past forged me. It trained me for hell. But I was done letting it dictate my wars. I stood up, wiping the dust off my jeans. It was time to clean house. Then a loud sound cut through the silence. Ding dong. 2 weeks since the funeral. The house smelled like rotting vegetation and stagnant water. The massive floral arrangements the base had sent were dying, dropping brown petals onto the hardwood. I was sitting cross-legged among the moving boxes, holding one of David's crimson Oklahoma Sooners t-shirts. It still smelled faintly of his Old Spice deodorant and sawdust. Then the doorbell rang, a sharp grating sound that made my chest tighten. I set the shirt down, smoothing out the fabric. I opened the heavy oak door. My parents and Leo stood on the porch. The heat of the Oklahoma afternoon pushed in past them, thick and oppressive. No one carried food. No one held out their arms for a hug. They didn't even look tired. They looked like they were stopping by on their way to a Sunday brunch. Ashley pushed past me without waiting for an invitation. Her heels clicked sharply against the floorboards. She stopped in the middle of the living room, wrinkling her nose at the cardboard boxes and the dying lilies. "I know things are hard right now, Olivia," she said, her voice carrying that fake syrupy tone she used when talking to the cashier at Whole Foods. "But life goes on. You can't just sit in the dark." It wasn't a condolence. It was an opening statement. Norman followed her in his hands shoved deep into his golf slacks. Leo trailed behind, holding a venti iced coffee, sucking on the green straw. They walked straight over to the navy blue sectional couch. They sat down right in the middle cushion, the exact spot where David used to read bedtime stories to Sophia. A cold spike of nausea hit the back of my throat. I stayed standing near the door. My posture shifted instantly. Shoulders back, feet shoulder width apart. Parade rest. We need to talk about the future, Norman said, not looking at me. He was examining the crown molding. Leo leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He had that smug, entitled grin he always wore right before he asked for something he didn't earn. Look, Liv, I've got this opportunity. Once-in-a-lifetime kind of deal. A sports bar down in the Blue Dome district. Prime real estate. It's gonna be a gold mine on game days. I just stared at him. My brain refused to process the words. A sports bar. Ashley leaned in, lowering her voice conspiratorially. Leo needs $40,000 for the buy-in, Olivia, just to get his foot in the door. With your captain's pay, and... She hesitated, but only for a fraction of a second. And the SGLI payout from David, you have more than enough sitting around. It's just sitting there. The service members' group life insurance. They weren't here to check if I was eating. They weren't here to hold my hand. They had run the math on my dead husband's life insurance policy, and they wanted their cut to fund Leo's drinking habit disguised as a business. The silence in the room stretched so tight it felt like it would snap and take my head off. I just buried them. My voice was barely a whisper. It shook. I hated that it shook. I just put my husband and my baby in the ground, and you're asking me for money. Ashley sighed a loud put-upon sound. She adjusted her designer purse on her lap. What she said next froze the blood in my veins. Listen to me, Olivia. I hate to say this, but maybe this is God's plan. My vision narrowed. The edges of the room blurred out. You're not tied down to that little family anymore. She continued, her voice completely devoid of empathy. You're free. You can focus on your real family now. Your blood. Helping Leo get this bar off the ground that helps all of our futures. God's plan. My husband bleeding out on the interstate. My 7-year-old daughter's chest crushed. God's plan so I could write a check for a sports bar. They saw the slaughter of my family as a financial liberation. A lucky break. Norman nodded, pointing a thick finger at me. The army is a temporary gig. You know that. But Leo's success? That's the family legacy. You owe it to this family to pitch in when we need it. Something snapped inside me. The scared, unloved 15-year-old girl in the hospital bed died right then and there. The sister who tried to buy her way into their good graces evaporated. The heat in my face vanished. A terrifying, ice-cold calm washed over me. The kind of calm that descends over a combat zone right after the first IED goes off. I stopped leaning against the wall. I stepped into the center of the room. I didn't yell. I dropped my voice an octave, the command voice. Get out! Leo blinked, pulling the straw out of his mouth. Come on, Liv. Don't be a bitch about this. It's an investment. I said, get the hell out of my house. The words cut through the room like razor wire. Ashley flinched. Norman stood up, his face flushing dark red. The vein in his neck bulged. You listen to me, he roared, pointing that heavy finger at my face. We are your family. If you turn your back on your brother right now, you are no daughter of mine. I looked at him. I looked at the man who gave away my dog, who left me to choke on pneumonia, who didn't bother to show up to watch me bury my child. I didn't blink. I didn't break eye contact. Then, sir, I said, my voice dead flat, I became an orphan 2 weeks ago. I walked past them. I grabbed the heavy brass handle of the front door and ripped it open. The blinding Oklahoma sun poured into the dark hallway. They stared at me. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in my mother's eyes. They realized in that split second that they had pushed too far. The ATM was closed. The punching bag was gone. Norman opened his mouth to speak, but the look on my face stopped him dead. He grabbed Ashley's arm. They shuffled out the door, Leo trailing behind them, suddenly very quiet. They stepped onto the porch. I grabbed the heavy oak door and slammed it shut with everything I had left. The frame rattled. The deadbolt engaged with a loud metallic crack. I stood in the hallway staring at the locked door. My chest heaved. The silence rushed back in, heavy and suffocating. I turned around and looked at the living room. It was empty. completely empty. I walked over to the boxes and picked up David's red Oklahoma Sooners shirt. I buried my face in the fabric. I needed a lifeline. I needed someone who wouldn't look at my grief and see a dollar sign. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and scrolled to a number I hadn't dialed in 3 years. My thumb hovered over the glowing screen. I was sitting on the floor, leaning back against the front door I had just deadbolted. The adrenaline was leaving my bloodstream. What replaced it was a cold, hollow ache. I had just amputated my own family. The bloodline was dead. And the family I'd built, David and Sophia, was buried under 6 feet of Oklahoma dirt. I was an island. I closed my eyes. A single memory cut through the fog. The funeral, back in the back row, far away from the polished brass and the empty family chairs. A man in a dark, ill-fitting suit. He stood at attention the entire hour. He didn't approach the casket. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He just stood the watch. Uncle Hector, Norman's younger brother. A Marine Corps veteran who lived out on a patch of scrub brush and dirt in rural Oklahoma. The black sheep of the Ramos family because he drove a beat-up Ford and didn't care about country club memberships. I pressed call. It rang 3 times. A gruff voice picked up over the sound of a tractor engine. Hector. Uncle Hector, it's Olivia. My voice broke. I didn't want it to, but the dam cracked. I pulled my knees to my chest, and the words just spilled out. The ugly, humiliating truth. The text message from Maui. The white lilies. The blue couch. The demand for David's SGLI payout to fund a sports bar. I waited for the judgment. I expected the usual family line. They're grieving too, Olivia. You need to be understanding. Instead, the tractor engine shut off. Dead silence on the line, just the sound of heavy breathing. When Hector finally spoke, his voice was tight, vibrating with a quiet, lethal anger. You listen to me, Olivia. He said the words slow and deliberate. You did nothing wrong, not a damn thing. You are a captain in the United States Army. You served this country with honor, Norman and Ashley. They are cowards. They just shamed the Ramos name. You don't owe them a dime. You don't owe them a second of your time. The breath rattled out of my chest. My shoulders dropped. For the first time in 34 years, an adult in my bloodline looked at the dynamic, pointed at my parents, and called it exactly what it was. I'm leaving now, Hector said. Don't lock the deadbolt. He hung up. 3 hours later, the heavy rumble of a diesel engine shook the front window of the housing unit. I opened the door. Hector climbed out of a dented F250. He didn't bring flowers. He carried a stained, heavy-duty insulated cooler in one hand and a faded canvas duffel bag in the other. He walked up the steps, his work boots heavy on the concrete. He pulled me into a tight, crushing hug. He smelled like motor oil, old leather, and peppermints. We didn't talk. We walked into the kitchen. He opened the cooler and pulled out a massive Tupperware container. The smell of real chicken broth, celery, and black pepper filled the sterile air of the house. He set it on the stove to heat up. Then he reached back into the cooler, pulled out 2 glass bottles of Shiner Bock, popped the caps on the edge of the counter, and handed me one. The glass was freezing. Condensation dripped onto my fingers. I took a pull. The dark beer burned going down. It grounded me. We sat at the small kitchen table. The silence between us wasn't heavy or demanding. It was the silence of 2 veterans, the kind of quiet that acknowledges the casualties without needing to list the names. Hector rubbed his thumb over the condensation on his bottle. Your father, he started, his eyes focused on the wood grain of the table, was always chasing the shine. He wanted the big house, the perfect son playing football, the country club dinners. But it was all just sheetrock and cheap paint, no foundation. He looked up at me. His eyes were dark, lined with years of sun and hard work. You joined the Army. You built a foundation. You know what honor is. Norman hates that. Because looking at you forces him to see exactly what he isn't. Their selfishness. That's a disease they've carried for 30 years. It has nothing to do with you. I swallowed hard. The knot in my throat was tight, but it wasn't suffocating anymore. They wanted David's insurance money. I whispered, the shame of it still stinging. Hector set his beer down with a hard clack. They're scavengers. You cut them off. That was a tactical decision. The right one. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. The sleeves of his flannel shirt rode up, showing the faded edge of an old Marine Corps tattoo. You're a logistics officer, right? He asked. I nodded. You know leadership. You know strategic planning. You know risk management. You kept entire forward operating bases running in the desert. He tapped the table with his index finger. Hard. That's not just soldier stuff, Olivia. That's executive leadership. That's power. I stared at him, the gears in my head slowly starting to grind forward. Don't let them define you. Hector said, his voice dropping into a command. Don't let this empty house define you. Use what the uniform taught you. Build something of your own. Build a legacy that David and Sophia would be proud to look at. He wasn't offering me sympathy. He was issuing a fragmentary order. He was handing me a weapon. I looked down at the cold bottle in my hand. I wasn't just a grieving widow. I wasn't just a scapegoat daughter. I was a commander. I took a long breath. The smell of the hot chicken soup mixed with the stale air of the empty house. I stood up. I walked over to the kitchen counter, grabbed a black Sharpie and a yellow legal pad. I sat back down across from Hector. I uncapped the marker. The sharp smell of ink hit the air. I pressed the tip to the paper. The black marker squeaked against the yellow paper, a sharp, violent sound in the empty house. I sat at the kitchen table until the sun came up, drinking coffee so black and stale it tasted like battery acid. By morning, my kitchen looked like a tactical operations center. I stripped the walls bare. Instead of maps of the Afghan desert, I covered the drywall with neon sticky notes. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. I stared at the paper. I was a logistics officer. I knew how to move heavy equipment through hostile territory. I knew how to secure a perimeter against people who wanted to kill us. Keeping a commercial warehouse safe in Oklahoma, that was just basic math. The next week, I submitted my separation paperwork. I took off the uniform for the last time. Then I drove to the bank. I took every single dime of my savings and the entire SGLI payout from David's death, the exact money my parents wanted to burn on a sports bar. And I opened a business account, Pana Secure Solutions. It was a vow, a heavy ironclad promise to the ghosts living in my heart. The first 6 months were a brutal, grinding war of attrition. I rented a 200-square-foot office in a dying strip mall. The fluorescent lights buzzed a constant, irritating hum that drilled into my temples. The carpet smelled like old cigarettes and damp cardboard. I worked 18 hours a day. I sat in a broken office chair at 2 a.m, staring at a blank website builder. I remembered David's large, calloused hands guiding mine over the keyboard years ago, teaching me basic coding. The memory felt like a physical weight crushing my chest, but I swallowed the grief and forced my fingers to type. Then came the cold calls, the rejections, the meetings. I walked into boardrooms wearing a sharp black suit, carrying a leather folio. And I hit a brick wall. The corporate world of the South was still an old boys' club. They saw a 34-year-old woman and immediately checked out. I remember one meeting in particular, a manufacturing firm in Broken Arrow. The owner sat behind a massive mahogany desk, leaning back in his leather chair. The room smelled of expensive cigars and cheap arrogance. He looked at my proposal, then looked at me over the rim of his reading glasses. "It's a nice presentation, Captain," he said, drawing out my rank like it was a punchline. "But let's be real. What does a little girl know about locking down a 50,000-square-foot industrial plant?" My jaw tightened. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cross my arms. I planted my boots flat on the carpet, straightened my spine, and locked eyes with him. "Sir?" I said, my voice dead flat and cold as ice. I spent my 20s planning security for forward operating bases in active war zones. I secured perimeters against coordinated mortar strikes. Your plant makes cardboard boxes. With all due respect, your facility is significantly less complex. He stopped smiling. He signed the contract 2 days later. But I knew I couldn't scale the operation alone. I needed a squad. I started going to local veteran support groups. I went to the dive bars near the base. I looked for the guys staring a hole through the wall. The men and women who survived the sand and the blood only to come home and get crushed by the quiet. The ones who lost their purpose the day they handed in their rifles. I didn't just offer them a job paying hourly wages. I offered them a mission. I hired a former combat medic to run my dispatch. I put a former turret gunner in charge of site audits. We didn't have employees, we had a fire team. We operated on military time. We communicated with precision. We treated every client asset like an outpost. The men I hired walked taller. They had a reason to shine their boots again. They had a commander who actually understood the ghosts they carried. We didn't spend a dime on advertising. We didn't have to. In Oklahoma, word of mouth is gospel. One warehouse manager talked to a logistics director. A logistics director talked to a bank executive. Pina Secure Solutions built a reputation made of iron. 1 year later, I stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass window of our new office. It was on the 12th floor of a downtown commercial building. The Tulsa skyline stretched out in front of me, the glass skyscrapers catching the orange fire of the setting sun. We were profitable. We had just closed a massive consulting contract with a statewide freight company. I held a mug of hot coffee, letting the heat soak into my palms. The office was quiet. The team had gone home. For the first time in a year, my shoulders dropped. The constant gnawing survival instinct in the back of my skull finally went to sleep. I thought about an audiobook I listened to on the long drives between client sites. Brené Brown. She said, "Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is feeling the fear, feeling the absolute terror of the unknown, and choosing to step forward anyway." I stepped forward. I took the ashes of my life and built a fortress. I wasn't the scared little girl in the hospital anymore. I wasn't the victim of a greedy family. I was the architect of my own future. I took a slow, deep breath, watching the streetlights flicker on down below. Peace. Actual hard-earned peace. Then my phone vibrated on the polished oak desk. I turned around. The screen lit up in the dim room. It wasn't a client. It was a notification from a private neighborhood Facebook group. And right below it, a text message from a number I hadn't seen in years. My Aunt Martha. "We need to talk about what you are doing to your parents." The cold crept right back into the room. The phone vibrated against the polished oak of my desk. A harsh, rattling sound that shattered the quiet of the office. It wasn't just a text anymore. The screen flashed an incoming call. Aunt Martha. I hadn't spoken to my father's older sister since the funeral. She was the loud, undisputed matriarch of the extended Ramos family. If Martha had an opinion, the rest of the bloodline fell in line. I stared at the glowing green accept button. My military instincts told me to gather intelligence before engaging. I let it ring. It went to voicemail. I already knew the tactical situation. In the year I spent building Pina Secure Solutions, my family's little empire had crumbled into dust. Leo's grand, once-in-a-lifetime sports bar in the Blue Dome district didn't even make it 8 months. He blew through his initial capital on high-end leather booths and flat screens, but forgot to pay the actual contractors. The liquor license got held up. The doors never officially opened. Norman and Ashley had co-signed the business loans. They took out a second mortgage on their house in the suburbs to keep Leo's sinking ship afloat. They were bleeding cash, drowning in debt, and completely ostracized by the few neighbors who knew how they behaved at David and Sophia's funeral. But toxic people don't look in the mirror when the house burns down. They look for a scapegoat. I was the perfect target. The voicemail icon popped up. I tapped the screen. "Olivia." Martha's voice crackled through the speaker, thick with cheap Chardonnay and heavy judgment. "We need to talk about this. This phase you're going through." I leaned back in my chair, staring out at the Tulsa skyline. "I hear you're doing real well for yourself." Martha continued, her tone dripping with venom. "Sitting up in some fancy downtown office. Meanwhile, your mother is in tears every day. Your father is about to lose the house because of Leo's bad luck. And you take that massive insurance payout from David's death and just turn your back on your own flesh and blood. How can you be so cold? Olivia, money changes people. Don't forget where you came from." The line went dead. I set the phone down. My jaw locked so hard my molars ached. Bad luck. She called Leo's incompetence, and my parents' greed bad luck. They hadn't just written me off. They had actively rewritten history. They launched a smear campaign. They painted me as the greedy, ungrateful daughter who cashed in on her dead husband and abandoned her starving family. I thought my silence, the strict no-contact rule I put in place, was a shield. I was wrong. To a liar, your silence is just a blank canvas for them to paint their own narrative. A sharp ping came from my laptop, an email from Uncle Hector. The subject line was blank. I clicked it open. It was a single image attachment, a screenshot from the Oak Creek Estates homeowners' private Facebook group, a closed online circle where the suburbanites gathered to complain about lawn heights and spread neighborhood gossip. The post was from my mother. It breaks a mother's heart to write this, the post began. Norman and I are going through a terrible financial hardship. We tried to keep it in the family, but we are drowning. What hurts the most isn't the money, it's the betrayal. I leaned closer to the monitor. The air in the room suddenly felt freezing. When we lost our son-in-law and our beautiful granddaughter, we thought it would bring us closer. Instead, our daughter Olivia took the massive life insurance money and walked away. She bought a new life. She refuses to answer our calls. She watched her brother's business fail and her parents face foreclosure, and she did nothing. We raised her to value family above all else. I just pray she remembers that before she's a captain, she's a daughter. 86 likes, 40 comments offering prayers and expressing disgust at my greed. My hands started to shake, not from sadness, from a rage so pure and hot it burned the oxygen out of my lungs. They didn't just play the victim. They didn't just lie about the money. They weaponized my rank. They took the title of captain, a title I bled for, a title I earned leading soldiers in the dirt while Leo was hungover on a Tuesday, and they used it to call me a traitor. I stared at the words, massive life insurance money. They were dragging David's memory through the mud to cover their own bounced checks. I closed the browser. I didn't cry. You don't cry when the enemy breaches the wire. You return fire. In the Army, the core ethos is drilled into your bone marrow. I will never leave a fallen comrade. For the past year, I thought I was honoring David and Sophia by walking away, by building something quiet and successful. But my honor was taking sniper fire. The truth was my comrade now, and it was bleeding out in the dirt of suburban gossip. If you've ever had a toxic family member run a smear campaign against you typing out lies on the internet while playing the absolute victim, drop the word truth in the comments right now. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know I'm not the only one who had to go to war just to clear my own name. I opened my email inbox. Sitting right at the top unread was an automated message from Aunt Martha, an invitation to the annual Ramos family reunion. Next Saturday, 6 in the evening. The venue was the Sputter, an old-school, iconic steakhouse in Tulsa. Dark wood vintage oil industry signs on the walls, prime rib. It was where the family went to pretend they were high society. Everyone in the bloodline would be there. Martha, my cousins, Leo, Norman, Ashley. The invitation had 2 buttons at the bottom, accept or decline. They sent it fully expecting me to ignore it. They wanted my absence. My empty chair at that steakhouse would be the ultimate proof of their lies. See? She didn't even show up. She doesn't care. I looked at the framed photo of David and Sophia sitting on my desk. David's smile, Sophia's missing front tooth. I moved the mouse. I didn't hesitate. I didn't second guess. I clicked, accept. Then I picked up my phone and dialed Hector's number. It was time to load the magazines. The high-pitched whine of the laser printer cut through the silence of my home office. It spit out warm paper one sheet at a time. I called it Operation Transparency. Emotion was a liability on the battlefield. I needed hard data. I had called Marcus, a buddy from my undergrad years, who now worked as a corporate bankruptcy attorney down in Dallas. I gave him Leo's name and the LLC attached to that failed sports bar. Public records. 2 hours later, a thick PDF hit my inbox. Chapter 7, Bankruptcy, Defaulted Vendor Payments, Outstanding Tax Liens. And right there, buried in the asset and liability filings, was the smoking gun. A second mortgage on Norman and Ashley's house in Oak Creek Estates. $300,000. They didn't lose their money to bad luck. They didn't fall victim to a bad economy. They burned it on Leo's bar tabs, unpaid contractors, and sheer, unfiltered arrogance. I ran my finger down the column of red ink. Every single number on this page was a hammer ready to smash their fake victim narrative to pieces. The paper felt warm against my fingers. This wasn't gossip. This was a receipt. I moved from the desk to the hall closet. I pulled down a heavy plastic storage bin. The lid cracked open, releasing the smell of old cardboard and dust. Financial records were good, but I needed character evidence. I went back to my laptop. I pulled up the screenshot Hector had sent me months ago. The Hawaii photo. I hit print. The machine whirred. The paper slid out. Bright blue water. My parents tanned and grinning behind designer sunglasses. But it wasn't the smiles that mattered. I took a red pen and circled the bottom right corner. A digital timestamp. The exact date and time I stood in my dress blues, listening to rifles crack, watching dirt hit David and Sophia's caskets. Next, the text message. The white lilies there looked so cheap. Print. The smell of hot toner filled the small room. Lastly, I dug into the bottom of the plastic bin. A stack of old letters I wrote to my college roommate during my sophomore year. Faded pay stubs from my graveyard shift at a diner stapled to rejection letters from my parents. They denied me $50 for used biology textbooks because Leo needed new custom football cleats. Each piece of paper was a bullet. I stacked them neatly on the desk, a full magazine. I shoved the stack into a thick manila folder and drove out to Hector's place. Dust kicked up behind my truck tires on the long, unpaved county road. His farmhouse smelled like old wood, burnt coffee, and diesel grease. I dropped the folder on his scratched kitchen table. I spread the papers out like a map of a hostile sector. Hector stood over the table. He didn't say a word. He read the bankruptcy filing. He looked at the red circle around the Hawaii timestamp. The muscle in his jaw jumped a hard knot under his weathered skin. He picked up the printout of the text message about the lilies. His thick, calloused thumb ran over the black ink. "They're walking into an ambush," he said, his voice a low, rough gravel. "It's not an ambush," I replied, my voice dead flat. "It's a mirror. I'm just forcing them to look at their own reflection." Hector looked up. His eyes were hard, the eyes of a Marine who had seen the worst of human nature and survived it. "You aren't going in alone. I made some calls this morning. Your cousins Mark and Sarah. They always knew Norman was a fraud, but they kept quiet to keep the peace. Not anymore. They're meeting us there." He tapped the table. "You bring the paperwork. We bring the bodies. We bear witness." It wasn't just me anymore. It was a front line built out of the family's outcasts. Friday night, the night before the reunion. The house was dead quiet. I didn't feel anxiety. I didn't feel fear. Just a strange cold calm settling deep in my chest. General Patton once said to prepare for the unknown by studying how others coped with the unpredictable. You don't react to the enemy. You plan. You execute. I laid my clothes out on the mattress. No dress blues. The uniform was for the country. This was a civilian fight. I wanted them to face Olivia Pina, the executive. I plugged in the iron. The steam hissed. I pressed a white button-down shirt until the creases along the sleeves were sharp enough to draw blood. Black tailored slacks. Black leather boots polished to a dull shine. I walked into the bathroom and looked in the mirror. The woman looking back wasn't the broken widow bleeding out on the living room floor a year ago. The scar was there, right behind the eyes, a permanent mark of the fire. But the posture was different. Shoulders locked back, chin parallel to the floor. A commander. I walked back to the bedroom. I gathered the stack of papers, aligning the edges perfectly. I slid the manila folder into a hard leather briefcase. I pushed the brass latches down. They locked with a heavy metallic snap. Saturday, 5:50 p.m. The late Oklahoma heat baked the asphalt. I parked my truck across the street from the sputter. The neon sign buzzed and flickered against the early evening sky. I grabbed the handle of the briefcase. The leather was cool and firm under my palm. I crossed the street. I could smell it from the sidewalk. Heavy mesquite wood smoke roasting prime rib and stale beer. The sound of forced laughter and clinking glasses leaked out from the building. They were in there, playing the victims, soaking up the pity. I stopped at the entrance. I took one deep breath of the hot, humid air. I reached out, grabbed the heavy iron handle of the front door, and pulled it open. The heavy iron door of the sputter swung open. The blast of air conditioning was freezing thick with the smell of charbroiled steak-baked potatoes and stale draft beer. I stepped inside. Hector was right behind me, a silent, heavy presence. We walked past the crowded front bar toward the private banquet room in the back. The walls were covered in rusty drill bits and faded oil company signs. I pushed the double doors open. The room went dead quiet. 30 people, aunts, uncles, cousins. My parents and Leo sat at the head table. Ashley was dabbing the corner of her eye with a cocktail napkin. Playing the grieving mother. Playing the victim. The moment I walked in, 30 pairs of eyes locked onto me. Most were curious. Some were outright hostile. Aunt Martha stood up. She tapped a spoon against her wine glass. "Everyone," she said, her voice loud and grating. "Before we eat, I want to say a few words. Family is the only thing that matters in this life. When one of us hurts, we all hurt." She looked directly at me. It was a trap set right out in the open. And when a family is struggling, those who have been blessed with fortune need to open their hearts. We need to remember where we came from, Olivia. And we need to help. A low murmur of agreement rippled through the room. They had all read the Facebook post. They had all heard the gossip. I was the villain who cashed in on a tragedy. I didn't sit down. I didn't break eye contact with Martha. I walked straight past the empty chair they had left for me. I walked to the small wooden podium at the front of the room, right next to the pull-down projector screen. I set my leather briefcase on the podium. The brass latches clicked loud in the silent room. "Thank you, Aunt Martha," I said. My voice didn't shake. It carried the low, flat authority I used on the firing range. "You talked about family. Tonight I want to talk about something else. The truth." I plugged my laptop into the HDMI cable. John Adams said, "Facts are stubborn things. And whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passion, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence." I hit a button. The projector hummed to life. A blinding white rectangle hit the screen behind me. "For the past 3 months, a story has been circulating," I said, looking right at Norman and Ashley. "A story that I abandoned my parents in their time of need, that I took a massive insurance payout and turned my back on a family ruined by bad luck." I clicked the mouse. The first document appeared. It was the Chapter 7 bankruptcy filing for Leo's LLC. "This is public record," I stated. "Filed in Tulsa County. This is a list of defaults. Unpaid contractors, unpaid liquor vendors, and right here," I pointed a laser pointer at a specific line of red text, "is a $300,000 second mortgage taken out on the house in Oak Creek Estates to cover business debts that never had a chance of turning a profit. This wasn't bad luck. It was gross mismanagement." The room shifted. The murmur stopped. People were squinting at the screen. And as for my supposed fortune, I continued, my voice colder now. "I didn't take a dime of my husband's life insurance for personal use. I poured every cent of it into starting a security firm, a firm I built working 18-hour days while the people at that head table were begging me to hand over the money to fund a sports bar." Ashley stood up, her face flushed red. "Olivia, stop this. You are embarrassing us." "I haven't started," I said. I clicked the mouse again. The bankruptcy filing vanished. It was replaced by a bright, high-definition photo. The blue water of Maui, the poolside cabana, Norman holding his Mai Tai, Ashley grinning behind her sunglasses. The silence in the banquet room became absolute. It felt like all the oxygen had been sucked out through the vents. "Look at the bottom right corner," I commanded. I circled the digital timestamp with the laser pointer. "That was taken on October 14th at 2 p.m., I said. At the exact moment that photo was snapped, I was standing in front of two open graves at Fort Sill. I was watching a military honor guard fold a flag over my husband's casket. Someone in the back row gasped, a sharp, audible intake of air. I hit the spacebar, the next slide loaded. The screenshot of the text message. The letters were massive on the screen. Finally, away from that depressing atmosphere, the white lilies there looked so cheap. Anyway, Leo really needed a vacation after enduring the news about Olivia. This, I said, pointing at the screen, was sent to my phone by mistake, while I was burying my 7-year-old daughter. The room erupted, not in agreement with Martha, in sheer, unadulterated disgust. Aunts and uncles were staring at Norman and Ashley like they were staring at a car wreck. Whispers turned into loud, angry voices. Ashley gripped the edge of the table. Her knuckles were bone white. That's Photoshop. She stammered, her voice high and panicked. She's making it up. She hates us. But her face betrayed her. The absolute terror in her eyes confirmed every single word on that screen. Before anyone else could speak, a heavy chair scraped loudly against the wood floor. Hector stood up. He didn't walk to the front. He just stood by his table, his massive shoulders squared. The room instantly quieted down. "I was there," Hector said. His voice was a low, heavy rumble that carried to every corner of the room. He stared directly at his older brother. "I was at the funeral. I stood in the back. I saw the empty chairs in the front row. I watched Olivia stand there by herself." He took a slow step forward. "I saw a soldier left behind by her own blood. You aren't victims, Norman. You are liars." That was the kill shot. There was no coming back from the word of a Marine. No spin, no gaslighting. The narrative was dead shot clean through the head. Norman opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He looked at Martha. Martha looked away, her face tight with revulsion. He looked at his nieces and nephews. They were staring at him with pure contempt. The mask was gone. The ugly, selfish core of the family was out in the open for everyone to see. Norman threw his cloth napkin on the table. He grabbed Ashley by the arm, pulling her out of her chair. Leo was already standing looking at the floor, his face pale. They didn't say a word. They turned and walked quickly toward the double doors. The silence as they walked the length of the room was deafening. No one tried to stop them. No one offered a comforting pat on the shoulder. They were ghosts. The heavy doors swung shut behind them. I stood at the podium. I reached down and closed my laptop. The screen rolled up with a loud snap. I had won. The truth was out. The war was over. I picked up the leather briefcase. The brass handle felt heavy in my hand. I walked out of the banquet room, leaving the stunned murmurs behind me. I pushed through the front door of the restaurant and stepped out into the humid night air. I stood alone in the dark parking lot. I waited for the rush of victory. I waited for the joy. It never came. The ride home from the sputter was completely silent. Hector drove his heavy F250. The amber glow of the dashboard lights illuminated the deep lines on his face. He kept his eyes on the road. I sat in the passenger seat staring out at the passing streetlights. There was no cheering, no high fives. I didn't feel the adrenaline rush of a victorious commander. I just felt gutted. I had fought my entire life for a seat at their table. I chased good grades, military promotions, anything to make them look at me the way they looked at Leo. Tonight I finally forced the entire family to see me, to acknowledge the truth, and I realized it didn't matter anymore. Winning that battle meant accepting that the parents I wanted, the ones who would protect me and love me unconditionally, were a fantasy. They never existed. The truth had set me free, just like the scripture said, but the freedom was cold and lonely. 3 days later, I was sitting at my desk when my cell phone buzzed. It was an unknown Tulsa number. I hit accept. "Pina." "Liv. Liv, please don't hang up." It was Leo. The smug, entitled drawl was gone. His voice was thin, shaking. He sounded like a cornered animal. "Everything's gone, Liv. The bank is taking the house. Mom can't even get out of bed and Dad won't speak to anyone. Aunt Martha blocked their numbers." A wet, pathetic sniffle came through the speaker. "I know I messed up. I know it. But please, Your family. Just help us out this one last time. We're drowning here. I sat perfectly still. The leather chair squeaked slightly under my weight. 6 months ago, that call would have triggered a panic attack. A year ago, it would have sent me reaching for my checkbook out of a desperate need to fix things. Now, I felt nothing. Not anger, not pity, just a profound, heavy exhaustion. He wasn't sorry for what they did to me. He was sorry that the consequences had finally arrived. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was looking for another bailout, another ATM. "Liv, are you there?" he pleaded. I didn't say a single word. I pulled the phone away from my ear, looked at the screen, and pressed the red button. Click. I blocked the number. I set the phone face down on the oak desk. It wasn't an act of cruelty. It was an act of survival. You don't negotiate with a fire. You cut off its oxygen. That night back at my quiet house, I opened a drawer and pulled out a yellow legal pad and a pen. I sat at the kitchen table. The same table where Hector had told me to build a legacy. I started to write. I didn't write an angry manifesto. I wrote a letter to Norman, Ashley, and Leo. I wrote down the memory of Dad teaching me how to ride a bike before he lost interest. I wrote down the smell of Mom's perfume when she used to actually hug me. Then I wrote down the cold hospital room, the empty chairs at the funeral, the text message from Maui. I put all the poison down on the paper, not to punish them, to get it out of my own blood. At the bottom of the last page, my handwriting was steady. I forgive you, not because your actions excuse what you did to my family, but because I refuse to carry the weight of your sickness anymore. I wish you peace, but my path will no longer intersect with yours. I folded the yellow pages into thirds. I walked over to the hallway closet, pulled down a cardboard memory box, and dropped the letter inside. I put the lid back on. I would never mail it. The post office doesn't deliver to ghosts. The next morning broke clear and bright, a classic blistering Oklahoma summer day. I drove through the heavy wrought iron gates of the Fort Sill National Cemetery. The tires crunched slowly over the white gravel. I parked the truck and walked across the manicured green grass. The air smelled of cut lawn and hot stone. I didn't bring white lilies. I brought 2 massive bright bouquets of yellow sunflowers. I stopped in front of the twin granite headstones. The sun beat down on my shoulders, warm and heavy. I knelt in the grass. I laid one bouquet in front of David's marker and the other in front of Sophia's smaller stone. I traced the engraved lettering with my index finger. The stone was rough and hot to the touch. I didn't cry. The tears had dried up months ago. A strange, quiet calm settled over me. "I did it, David," I whispered. The wind rustled the dry leaves of a nearby oak tree. I told our story. I kept the perimeter secure. I shifted my hand over to Sophia's headstone. I brushed a blade of grass off the granite. "You and Dad," I said, my voice barely carrying over the wind. "You're the only family I need. You always were." I stood up. I looked out over the endless rows of white marble markers. The pain of losing them was still there. It would always be there, a heavy stone sitting in the bottom of my ribcage. But it was no longer a shackle dragging me down. It was armor. They tried to bury me with their lies, but they forgot I knew how to dig trenches. I turned away from the graves and walked back toward the truck. The keys jingled in my hand. I opened the heavy steel door. 2 years. The grind changed shape. It wasn't the bone-deep 18-hour survival panic anymore. The old office smelling of cheap carpet glue and desperation was gone. The new suite smelled of lemon polish, cold glass, and fresh coffee. I stood in the glass-walled conference room of Pina Secure Solutions. Below, the downtown Tulsa traffic crawled along the sun-baked asphalt. We owned the whole 12th floor. I stepped back from the whiteboard. Marcus, a former Army Ranger with a prosthetic leg and a mind like a steel trap, took the dry erase marker from my hand. He was my VP of operations now. I finally learned how to delegate. I stopped trying to carry every heavy sandbag myself. We hired 30 more veterans this year alone, men and women who knew how to secure a perimeter and read a room before a threat ever materialized. They came home and lost their purpose. I just gave them a new mission. We dominated the commercial security sector in the Midwest. No flashy billboards, just ironclad contracts and quiet, brutal efficiency. I grabbed my black coffee from the oak table. It was still hot. I didn't have to drink it cold at 3 in the morning anymore. But the company was just the engine. The real work happened completely off the clock. I drove my F-2502 hours east of the city. The oppressive Oklahoma concrete heat broke, giving way to the cool, damp shade of the pine trees around the lake. I parked the truck and walked toward the heavy smell of wood smoke and roasting hot dogs. Sophia's Sunshine Project. I took 20% of the company's net profit and funneled it straight into a hard partnership with TAPS, the Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors. Gold Star Families. I walked past the heavy log cabins. A dozen kids were running across the grass, screaming and throwing water balloons. Kids who knew exactly what the sharp crack of a 21-gun salute sounded like. Kids who had tightly folded American flags sitting on their mantles back home. A little girl with scraped knees and a missing front tooth ran past me laughing hard. She looked like Sophia. My chest tightened, a hard, familiar physical ache behind my ribs. But it didn't drop me to my knees anymore. I wasn't Captain Pina out here. I wasn't the CEO. I sat on a rough wooden bench next to a young widow. She wore her husband's tarnished dog tags around her neck, the cold metal pressed against her collarbone. We watched the fire crackle. We didn't talk about moving on. We didn't offer empty, sickening platitudes about God's plan. We just shared the quiet, heavy understanding that comes from surviving the absolute worst day of your life. I promised David and Sophia I would build a legacy out of the ashes. Every time one of those kids smiled, I kept that promise. Sunday evenings belonged to Hector. I pulled up to his farmhouse just as the sun started to dip. The rich smell of smoked brisket hung heavy in the humid air. He stood by the massive iron smoker in his backyard holding a pair of steel tongs, a glass bottle of Schienerbach resting on the wooden prep table. He looked older. His hair was completely gray now, but his shoulders were still squared like a Marine standing at parade rest. He handed me a cold beer. We clinked the glass bottles together. A sharp clack. "Martha called today," Hector said, flipping a massive cut of meat. The fat sizzled violently against the hot iron grate. I took a long drink. "Yeah, what did she want?" "Asked if we were coming to the Labor Day cookout. Made sure to ask about you specifically." I nodded. After the fallout at the Sputter, the family fractured. Norman, Ashley, and Leo vanished into their own mess of debt foreclosure and denial. I haven't heard their voices in 24 months. I never will again. But the rest of the bloodline, the cousins, the aunts, the uncles who finally saw the ugly truth, they respected the boundary. They called, they showed up. They treated me like a human being, not a walking ATM. Hector didn't talk about Norman. Norman was a ghost, a cautionary tale about a weak man who loved a fake image more than his own daughter. Hector was the father I always wanted, the man who showed up in the dark and handed me a flashlight. I drove back to the city. The sun dipped below the flat horizon, the famous Oklahoma golden hour. It washed the empty streets in a deep, burning orange. I walked into my empty office. The servers hummed faintly down the hall. I dropped my keys on the desk. They hit the dark wood with a heavy thud. I didn't look out the window. I looked at the wall behind my desk. No corporate framed art. Just a massive corkboard covered in photographs. A picture of Marcus and the guys at a training site. A picture of Hector holding up a massive largemouth bass at the lake. A picture of the Gold Star kids covered in mud and laughing at the summer camp. And right in the dead center, pinned firmly to the board, a picture of David and Sophia. David wearing that crimson Oklahoma Sooners shirt. Sophia sitting on his shoulders, holding her plastic purple stethoscope. I walked over. I reached out and ran my index finger across the smooth, glossy paper, the faces of the people I loved more than breathing. I didn't break down. I smiled. A genuine, quiet smile in the empty room. The grief didn't shrink. I just grew a much larger life around it. I took the ashes of a burned-down house and forged them into solid steel. I am Olivia Pina, a soldier, a mother, a survivor. I drew the line in the dirt, and I held it. If my story resonated, hit that like button, leave a comment below, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for listening to my journey. I will see you next time.